their cries, the cries of the laborers, had gone up to the Lord of hosts, or as he put it in verse 4, the Lord of Sabbath, indicating that these cries were not unheard, but they were up to and I think I used the term last week, to the commander-in-chief of the universe, that someone was hearing those cries, that the Lord himself was hearing those cries, and while they might not have been answered immediately, there was coming a day when these would have been punished for their wrongdoings. And as a result of that, we pick up in chapter 5, and I want to read chapter 5, verse 5. And he, again, remember, he's addressing here now these rich landowners, and he says, "You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter." Now, what did he mean by that? Well, the lifestyle that's described here, obviously, by James is one of luxury and extravagance. And it was made possible in large part because, as I said just a moment ago, because of their depriving the workers of their due wages. Their lifestyle, the lifestyle of these rich people, contributed nothing, apparently, to the welfare of others. They were using what they had in both a useless and wasteful way. It might remind us of the parable that Jesus spoke in Luke chapter 12. For just a minute, turn back to that, to Luke chapter 12, and let me read a couple of verses there. Luke chapter 12, verse 15, I believe it is. Yes, Luke chapter 12, the parable of the rich fool. He says, he says in verse 15, "And he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." And of course, that certainly applies to the rich landowners here. "Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will bestow all my crops and goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." In other words, live the good life. That's what he's saying to himself. "But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So it is he who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God." And that's what these rich landowners were doing, laying up treasures for themselves by their defrauding the workers. Those who would, as is the case here, would live for pleasure alone eventually lose the ability to live for any other reason. All of their thoughts are consumed by what they can lay up for themselves. Now, this phrase to me, "you have fattened your hearts," is an interesting one. It's really the idea of an animal being fattened for the slaughter. We've all seen pictures, and perhaps some have even had this experience themselves. You have an animal that you want to fatten up for food, or maybe you've seen pictures of or illustrations of these cattle that are put on feedlots and fattened, but their ultimate future is destruction. They're going to be slaughtered for someone's dinner table eventually. And he's saying that you have. This is a picture of an animal being fattened for the slaughter. Animal is provided with all the food it can consume, but its destiny is not one that's really something to look forward to. The Jew here that he's addressing here is supplied with everything the heart can desire in an earthly sense, all the riches they can desire. Brother Wood said that the day of slaughter refers to the judgment scene. That's his take on it. Brother Kaufman says it refers to the forthcoming of the destruction of Jerusalem. The Old Testament term meaning, of course, the day of judgment, the day of slaughter. So there's no disagreement between the two here. Brother Woods concludes his thoughts on this with the remark, it's as if James is saying to these people, you are now at the judgment. You're now at the judgment. This is the way you lived. This is how you lived your life. Therefore, your destruction is inevitable because you prepared yourselves for this destiny rather than preparing for things eternal. The day of slaughter, or you have fattened your hearts, as if you will. Verse 6, you have condemned, you have murdered the just, he does not resist you. I think one translation says there, added by the translators, you have murdered the just one. The rich, and this is kind of typical of what a courtroom scene might be, the rich were able to influence even the courts of the land and influence the decisions of the judges, indicated here by the phrase, you have condemned. It's as if there's going to be maybe a trial held, but the outcome has already been decided. It's just a mockery of justice, perhaps. The idea that a trial has been held with the intent of judging the guilt or innocence of an accused, but the accused had already been judged guilty by those that had arraigned him. And the trial, as I said, was just a mockery of justice. That there was really nothing to the trial. They had the phrase that they had murdered, in that they were carrying out the predetermined sentence that had been given by the court that they had influenced. Now, there are two basic views on who the just is here. Or if you read it, the just one, the one word one there is supplied by the translator. I think both of them are certainly valid, and ultimately they say the same thing. One view is that the just is referring to any righteous one in contrast to the wicked, any righteous person. The other view is that it refers to Christ, the just one. And that's often a phrase that's used elsewhere in the New Testament. The second view is probably the one that's more likely, in that Christ is often referred to by this term in passages like in Acts chapter 3, verse 14, in Acts chapter 7, verse 52, and in 1 John 2:1. In fact, in that Acts chapter 3, 14, Peter is preaching here. It's just after the account of Peter and John encountering the lame man at the gate of the temple. And Peter says, but you have denied the Holy One and the just, and there's that term that's used again, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you. We know that account of how that the crowd had asked for Barabbas to be released to them instead of Jesus being set free. But so that is more likely the righteous or just can be applied only, the righteous one or the just one can be applied only to Christ as the antitype of all who have died unjustly for the cause of Jehovah. So very likely that's what the word you here refers to, the rich persecutors, and he, of course, refers to the just one that's used in this verse. Also there in that passage, the phrase, he does not resist you, refers to the fact that Christ did not resist his antagonist but submitted himself to their persecution. And of course, we can read about that in Isaiah chapter 53. That whole discourse there talks about Christ. And again, this is quoted by Luke in Acts chapter 8 with this passage. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So it's very likely there that the just one is referring to Christ. But in either case, if it's any just person who is being persecuted for the cause of Christ, certainly the same application would apply. James had just addressed the rich non-Christian and warned them of the reward that they would receive as a result of that ungodly lifestyle that they were living. Now he returns to address the Christians as brethren who had suffered at the hands of the rich, and he urges them, and this is going to be a theme that runs through the rest of this chapter, to be patient until the day that the Lord would settle these accounts. And there is ultimately, certainly a reckoning day that's coming. It's like James is saying this: I know that you're experiencing great trials. I know that you're experiencing persecutions. But this will someday come to an end, and there will be at this case, a fair judge, a righteous judge who will settle these accounts. And in that, he's telling these, remember, this is a general epistle. James is a general epistle. And remember, he's telling them, just be patient. Things will work out. You know, sometimes it's hard for us to be patient. And these people were not unlike what we are today. It's hard for us to be patient sometimes. And he's telling them. Now, it may have been, you know, it's easier for us to say patient, for them to be patient, but think of what they were going through. Think of the persecution. Sometimes it's easy for us to tell others to be patient, and we might not understand the trials and difficulties that they're going through. But we have to look, how would we react if we were under those same circumstances? So there was a lot of persecution to these Jewish Christians, and he's telling them ultimately that justice will be meted out. There is coming a day when they're... So look at verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren. Notice again the reference there to brethren. So he's addressing at this point the brethren, the Christians. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. And I love this example that he uses, this illustration that he uses in the concluding part of this. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until he receives the early and latter rain. Do you know of anyone who has to be more patient than a farmer? And James is using this. He's illustrating this idea of them to be patient and wait. To be patient here literally means to be long of temper. We've all used the expression perhaps short-tempered. An old phrase that I've heard in times past, someone who flies off the handle. Y'all ever heard that term? Someone who maybe flies off the handle. Well, he's saying don't be that way. Be long on patience, slow to anger, slow to wrath perhaps, not one short of the will to persist. Long-suffering might be a good term to use here. Be long-suffering. The word patience used in James, or patient rather, patience, used in James chapter 1 and the word used here in James chapter 5 are not the same words. Think about this. In chapter 1, the word means to bear up under, and is used to denote patience with people. Now, some people it's easier to be patient with, I suppose, than others. That's human nature. We're more patient sometimes with some people than we are. We need to be patient with all people. The second word used in chapter 5 means to be patient with things. Patient with things. In chapter 5, the brethren are to, and remember it is the brethren here, the Christians, they are to exhibit long suffering with their tormentors, meaning to bear up under the burdens, the things here, be patient with things, which weigh so heavily upon you, knowing that the day of reckoning is coming, when God will execute his righteous judgment. So be patient with these things. Be patient with what's falling upon you, because there is a day when God will execute his judgment. Those who remain faithful know that one day God will properly punish those who do wrong, and those who remain faithful will be greatly rewarded. We're promised that. The reference to the coming of the Lord, the coming of Christ here, refers to the second coming of Christ or the second advent. Brother Kaufman says that this could have reference to the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem. That's something that they were certainly be familiar with, which the Jews knew was coming before this generation had passed away. They knew of the imminent destruction of Jerusalem. However, he concludes that in the broader sense, it refers to the second coming of Christ. It's worth noting that Christ himself, in Matthew chapter 24, in Mark chapter 13, and also in Luke 21, in all three of those chapters, blended the prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem with those of the coming of the Lord at the end of the world. And you have to be careful when you read those to make sure that you understand which part is referring to which. Is it referring to the destruction of Jerusalem or the second coming of Christ? In telling these brethren to be patient, James now returns to a practical example that all would relate to, that of the farmer or the husbandman. The farmer of all people will be well aware of the planting and harvesting process. You know, the farmer has to make sure that the soil has the right moisture content when he plants his seed. Has to be patient and wait on what James describes as the early rain, or the proper moisture content to make that seed germinate and spring forth. Then, as the seed matures and grows into a plant, the farmer has to wait on the rain. Think of the patience. We've all witnessed, and probably if you think back to this past June and July, how many cornfields did you drive by and see the leaves of the corn folded up, waiting for that, if you will, that latter rain? What could the farmer do about it? Well, unless he had an irrigation system, there was nothing he could do. He had to wait for the rains. The hay crop was the same way. He had to wait, the farmer had to wait patiently for the rain. So the process itself requires patience. Now, if you think about it, when does the harvest come? When does the harvest for the farmer come? It does not come with the early rain. It does not even come with the latter rain. It comes after that in many cases. Anyway, the harvest being at the end of the effort. At the end of the efforts when the harvest comes, and not at the beginning. Again, the farmer has faith that the moisture needed to produce the crop will come, and that he cannot speed the process, but must rely on the fact that God will supply what is needed. In other words, patience. And that's what he's trying to get these Jewish brethren to see, even as they're being persecuted. You got to be like the farmer. You got to be like the husbandman. You got to wait, if you will, on the rain. Any comments so far on those three verses?
Back in Job 21, verse 13, what you were talking about, the slaughter, in verse 5, it says that they were talking about them living in pleasure, but sinners are living in grave. So I'm wondering if maybe the grave is used with the word slaughter in the Old Testament. Not sure.
Yeah. I'm not sure I heard everything you said, Brother Layton, but
With the idea in mind of death, it brings the slaughter because that's the end.
yeah.
I like what Brother Woods talked about the idea of the slaughter. It could refer to the judgment,
Yes, it certainly could refer to the judge. I think in the broader sense, that's what it does refer to. Yeah, and that's like you say, that's what he pointed out in that verse. Yeah. Other comments? Anybody? Okay, look at verse 8. And again, notice how he begins verse 8. You also be patient. In other words, just like the farmer is waiting on the latter rain, verse 8 says, you also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. The coming of the Lord is at hand. The word establish here is used to mean to make stable, to make something stable, to strengthen, to make the purposes of the heart firm and sure. In other words, to be unwavering. Be patient, be unwavering. Certainly in the face of trials, which is what these people were facing. They were to gain their strength through the fact that they knew that one day the Lord is coming and that they would ultimately be vindicated. Ultimately, they would be vindicated, even though they're suffering persecution now. Hebrews 11 is a great source of comfort to the Christian, for it demonstrates through the lives of the faithful that there is a victory, an ultimate, if you will, triumph to those who remain faithful even under great conflicts and hardships. The return of Christ is so sure, so real, that the fulfillment can be described as near at hand in that it could come at any time. It could come at any time. James is not offering here in this verse evidence to say that it would necessarily come in their lifetime, because what did James know? James knew that only the Father himself knew when the coming of the Lord would be. So he's not saying it's coming necessarily in your lifetime, and we know that it didn't come in their lifetime now. Could it come in our lifetime? We don't know. It certainly could. But we ultimately know that it is coming. And that's what he's saying. Establish, strengthen, make firm, be sure, make stable your hearts, because one day this event will certainly occur. Verse 9, so if you're going to do that, if you're going to be patient, if you're going to establish your heart, if you're going to be firm in your convictions, then he urges them further. Look at verse 9. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So don't grumble against one another. Do not keep on groaning, as it were, against one another. You know, if you're suffering hardship, sometimes it's easy to blame others. Maybe even for your own troubles, when they may not be anything but your own choosing. Remember that the brethren were experiencing at this time. Remember what they were experiencing. Remember what they were going through. They were often impatient, they were fretful, and often had the disposition to blame others even for their own troubles. It was easy to find fault with others. It's easy to point fingers at others, and all this makes their own lives miserable and cause problems for others as well. You know, if you blame someone else, not only is it going to cause problems for them, but it's also going to cause problems for yourself. To blame or grumble against another is to judge that person. And in so doing, one is violating the royal law that James alluded to earlier in this epistle. The royal law meaning love your neighbor as yourself. The judge in this case is, of course, Christ. And the phrase standing at the door denotes the nearness of his coming, and that he is ready to execute judgment. The nearness of his coming. When's it going to be? Well, we don't know, but we know that it is coming. Verse 10, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Again, he alludes to the Old Testament here. James is saying here that in order to have a proper perspective on suffering and patience, these brethren should look at the example of the prophets. The word example here is used to denote a figure or a copy. He's saying you're going to have to be like these Old Testament prophets. The readers of the epistle would be familiar with the prophets because of their Jewish ancestry. They knew who these people were that he was referring to, and they could easily relate their sufferings to those that the prophets endured. The sufferings experienced by Isaiah or Jeremiah, Daniel, Elijah, and others who suffered patiently would serve as examples to the Jewish brethren and remind them if the prophets could endure, so could they. Look back with me at Hebrews chapter 11 just a minute. Look at Hebrew. Now, oftentimes when we read this, we emphasize specifically, and rightly so, those prophets that are named there. But look, and I read this, I don't know that I had ever really appreciated this, perhaps as I should have. Look at Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 30 with me. And as we go through this, look at those who were unnamed, perhaps. Those who were unnamed. Now, most all these people, you've heard sermons on this, but verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. Remember, James mentioned her back there earlier. Specifically, James mentioned Rahab, and he also mentioned Abraham. Verse 32, and what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and Jephthah and also of David and Samuel and the prophets. Not necessarily named here. But look at what they suffered. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women who received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had, and this is the kind of the anonymity, I suppose, that he talks about here. Think of all these people that this could apply to, that we don't have any record of who they were specifically. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonments. They were stoned. They were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Kind of sad to read that, isn't it? Of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these have obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. They were promised something better. And just think about all those unnamed people there, that many of these perhaps knew of or knew some like those. And James is certainly encouraging them to take these as examples, like we do today many times. How many sermons have you heard preached from Hebrews chapter 11 and of the patience and suffering that these prophets went through? And he's trying to remind them, if the prophets suffered these things, if just ordinary people suffered these things, you can bear up under them as well. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke the words, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Remember how many times we've noticed here that James has referred to or has writings that are very similar to those words that Christ used in the Sermon on the Mount. A prophet here that James spoke about is one who spoke for or who spoke on behalf of another. And thus they were in both the Old Testament and New Testament those who delivered the message of God. That's what prophets did. In other words, they were the mouthpieces of God. When one rejected the message of the prophets, he not only rejected the message, but also the one who sent the message. And in this case, that would be God. Many times the message was not well received, and those who rejected the message were rebellious, and they showed their resentment by evilly treating the messengers. You've often heard the expression, kill the messenger. You don't like what you hear, kill the messenger. Well, really when they killed the messenger by rejecting the words, they were actually rejecting Christ. The phrase, "who spoke in the name of the Lord," indicates certainly that they spoke by the authority of God and according to His will when they rejected those people. Verse 11, "Indeed we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful." Again, a reference to the Old Testament. The word blessed here is used to denote the inward happiness that results from the peace in the hearts of those who faithfully serve the Lord. It had to be an inward peace, a peace in the heart. Those who endured were those whose faith did not fail in the hours of their trial. Their faith was steadfast. It's those who look for a building made by God. It is not James's intention to mean that the reward would be received in this lifetime, but that God would in time mete out the punishment to the wicked in the days of judgment, while at the same time the one who endured would receive the blessing they had worked for. James had already written concerning the patience of farmers and the patience of the prophets. Now for a third example, he turns to the man Job of the Old Testament. All of their lives, no doubt these Jewish Christians, they were all Jewish Christians that he's addressing now, had heard and read of the agonies that Job had experienced. The book of Job itself demonstrates the fact that a faithful man, a faithful person, a faithful woman will bear any form of trial rather than forsake God. Job and his experience provide us with an example of unwavering faith in the face of tremendous trials. James is saying that we in our day and from our vantage point can see the design and purpose of God's plan in Job's case. Now, could Job see all of God's plan? Well, probably not. But Job had enough faith to do what? To be willing to accept the fact that God was going to take care of him ultimately. You remember, he lost everything he had. You talk about trials. Perhaps these trials that these Christians were facing pale in comparison to what Job went through. We see the end intended for Job. We know what happened in the case. The design or purpose of God's plan is to show that God is full of compassion for those who suffer, and he does not turn a deaf ear to their cries. Remember back there in that previous verse, what do you say about your cries have gone up to the Lord of hosts? There's a commander-in-chief that hears these cries. And while it might not be taken care of immediately, ultimately there is a reckoning day. Just as Job was faithful to God, the Christian today must show patience and unwavering faith in times of trials and persecutions. Any comment anybody want to make? Any thoughts? I'd be happy to hear them. Okay, verse 12. This is an interesting verse here. But above all, my brethren, still addressing the Christians, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. I think this verse has sometimes been taken out of its context and used to say that people can't take an oath, for example, in a courtroom. That's not what this verse is saying. Hasn't been too many weeks ago that Chris Cooper and I had to take an oath. We were called on for jury duty, and we had to take an oath. That's not what this is talking about. James turns to recurring admonitions here about their speech. He's talking about be careful what you say. Basically, when it comes down to it, he's saying, let your word be your bond. Do what you say you're going to do. The swearing referred to here is taking an oath. In the context here, it probably refers to invoking a curse on those who were persecuting them. Remember the context. It's invoking a curse on those who were persecuted. That's the oath he's talking about. The Greek refers to affirming or denying by an oath. That's what the Greek word for oath here. He's saying, give attention and priority to this matter. Watch what you say. Watch how you speak. Watch how you're talking, we might say. James had previously discussed the improper use of the tongue And in this context, he discusses arbitrary swearing or flippantly using God's name to guarantee the truth or fulfillment of the oaths they were taking. And here's what he was facing. Some rabbis had held that one was bound to the truth only when the name of deity was mentioned, on the ground that God became part of the agreement. But if the name of God was not used, then the oath did not have to be kept. Is this saying if you don't use God's name in it, then it's really not valid? That's what some of the rabbis were saying. According to the Pharisees, oaths not taken in God's name were not binding. For the Christian, his word should be his bond, and they were not to swear vengeance against their oppressors. Included in this verse would be a warning to Christians also against euphemisms, that is, using what we might consider a weaker term when we really mean a stronger term, the substitution of a word or phrase that seems less objectionable. That's what a euphemism is. James is saying that those who fall into judgment will stand in judgment for their actions. This statement by James has nothing to do with solemn and serious civil oaths which a person might take in a court of law today. The warning here is against using God's name flippantly. In fact, there are several references, if you look back in the scriptures, of oaths that were taken. And there's some in Deuteronomy 6:13. Let me read that just for a minute. Deuteronomy 6:13, I believe it is. Deuteronomy 6:13. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oaths in his name, according to the New King James Version. Also, a similar passage in Deuteronomy 23:21. And Paul, even in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians 5:27, I think he used the word there, affirmed or whatever. And even Jesus in Mark 14:61, you remember, was placed there and called to answer that. So the oath that the swearing here is referring to what we might say is using God's name in vain, or something of that nature, being flippant about using God's name and not against taking a serious civil oath. Any comment about that verse? We're about out of time this morning. We're going to stop with that verse, but any comment before we conclude our lesson this morning? Thank you again for your attention, and let me say thank you again to those of you who are listening, watching us virtually. We appreciate your presence. Next Sunday, Brother Irby will be back to do his week in September, and then we have one more lesson from this, and we'll conclude the rest of the chapter in our last lesson from this. Thank you very much.